Steve begins his journey in Chad. There isn't much in Chad because it's a lowly developed country and everything kind of sucks. He works on a small farm practicing subsistence agriculture to support himself and his wife. Eventually, his wife falls ill, and since Chad is a lowly developed country, there isn't enough access to sufficient healthcare. Steve decides to evaluate his options. He knows he has to get out of Chad, but doesn't know where to go next. He ultimately decides to migrate to America due to its low unemployment rate reflecting prominent job opportunity, better standard of living and healthcare evident by its life expectancy, its growing GDP over time which suggests a stable economy, and the guaranteed rights and freedoms under the Constitution. Steve decides to use all his savings to migrate to America to hopefully get a basic labor job and send home remittances in hopes of his wife following him to America. Steve contacts a friend that moved to America a few years ago, and after being sponsored by his prospective U.S. employer and having his petition approved, he's granted an immigrant visa. Steve then travels to the western coast of Africa and boards a boat, and after 8 days arrives in Savannah, Georgia. Savannah has a population of around 148,000. Savannah's natural increase rate is 0.19%, and its doubling time is 368 years, reflecting a stable, mostly static population. Most of Savannah's population are working-class people aged from 20 to 30. These working-class people are drawn to Savannah due to its major port, which promises job opportunities, and its iconic art school, SCAD. Since Savannah is a city, obviously, it has a high concentration of people, functional complexity, it's a center of institutional power, it's dynamic, changing, and human-created, linked to other cities, and contains contradictions. Minus the irregularity that we just discussed, Savannah's population pyramid reflects that it's in stage 4 the demographic transition model, corresponding to America's development level as a whole. For the most part, Savannah is observed to have a lot of characteristics that are common across cities in America, but we'll skip over them for now. Steve works with his friend down at the Garden City terminal doing unskilled labor. The pay is minuscule, and it's reflected in his living situation. Since the population density is so high, and Steve doesn't own a car, he's forced to live in the inner city ghetto. This is because he has to live as close as he can to work, using things like public transportation. His search for affordable housing was a struggle, but he eventually found a rundown apartment to live in. Here, Steve witnesses things such as filtering, gentrification, gang violence, and a lot of crime. Since Steve is part of the underclass, he's trapped in an unending cycle of economic and social problems. Steve's also more susceptible to crime due to racial inequality, his house being surrounded by hotspots. All the gentrification around him contributes to racial and ethnic tension, and he's always at risk of being displaced, potentially becoming homeless. As Steve stayed longer in the ghetto, he slowly became more accustomed to the cultural landscape of the place. He adopted the culture around him, which was learned and passed down. He started to dress differently, speak differently, and adopt various habits and customs. He also started to listen to new music, changing from the traditional folk music he learned in Chad to new popular music. Besides the obvious change in pace, the two styles of music are vastly different. Eventually, Steve saves enough money to send bigger remittances home to his wife and begins to think about flying her out to stay with him. He eventually decides against it because of his living situation, and after Steve's DoorDash gets stolen for the third time, he decides enough is enough and wants to move out. Unfortunately, although it is illegal, Steve falls victim to housing discrimination. The bank refuses to give him a loan due to him living in a high-risk neighborhood, but they insist it's for other reasons. Steve puts in his 2 weeks, ignores the 2 weeks, and in his new attire, immediately boards a train, going anywhere. He finds himself in Atlanta after a 4-hour-long bus ride. Luckily, he saves himself a lot of money because moving companies aren't necessary. All he owns is a tracksuit on his back, 24K gold chains, and autographed vinyl of Slippery When Wet by Bon Jovi. Atlanta is the largest city in Georgia, following the primate city rule. Having a population of 500,000, its population density is near triple of Savannah's at around 3,700 per square mile. Due to the increased population density, Steve has an even harder job finding housing, but after landing himself in the inner city ghetto again, he's lucky enough to get hired to a local grocery store. Living in the Atlanta ghetto, he begins to realize much of the culture in Savannah's ghettos was a result of diffusion, Atlanta being the hearth. The spread of said culture can be described as both expansion and contagious diffusion in the US, but can also be described as relocation diffusion, as much of the ghetto culture specific to American cities, like musical style, fashion, and other traits, stretch overseas into places like London. Fast forwarding 2 years, Steve is fully settled into Atlanta. Steve has experienced something called time-distance decay, where he's began to disassociate himself from his previous beliefs and ideas in Chad, considering himself American now. Steve, considering himself America, exemplifies his change in perception of his cultural identity and/or nationality. He's fully accepted the culture traits of Atlanta now, changing his fashion style, dialect, and more, just like how it changed in Savannah. Steve has built himself a successful life in Atlanta. He's made enough money to move his wife from Chad and get her proper medical attention.